The Why Didn't You Test That podcast experiences an insight on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. I'm Rich Jordan. Joining me today, co-host, making his first appearance on the main stage, I believe, is Ben Riley. Hello Ben, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yes, hello everybody. Thanks for having me, Rich. You may have recognised my face from the After Hours. Sometimes I accidentally call the After Dark podcast, but I've been promoted. I've made it all the way up to the main stage. So thanks, Rich. Yeah,
Heady heights.
Ben Riley.
Yeah.
So I always make some terrible joke about being a chaos officer here at Curiosity, but sort of have the pleasure of annoying Natalie Cole, who is with us today. At a conference over in Orlando, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. So,
Cool. Cheers, Ben. And you stumbled a friend early on there. Introducing our very special guest, we've got Natalie Cole. I'm going to read out Natalie's bio very quickly before we bring her in. So, focused on people, process, and technology, Natalie is a passionate and driven software quality engineer and assurance manager with a track record of delivering robust quality applications in software development projects. Currently leading and supporting an innovative team of 10 software engineers and quality assurance analysts who improve software quality and prevent production defects in 5 supply chain applications, actively implementing software quality best practices for the team. Welcome to the podcast, Natalie.
Welcome.
How you doing?
Hi, Rich. Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me. I'm doing well. How are you guys doing?
Yeah, very well, thank you. Excited to talk to you today. Let's get straight into it. So, I kind of read out kind of what you do or the teams you lead day to day. Do you want to just expand on that slightly in terms of obviously team of 10? What's the kind of the journey been like in terms of you kind of managing that team and some of the kind of the improvements, challenges that you've been facing into recently?
So I started leading / managing this team in July 2022. I got a new job at my current company and I inherited this team of 10 QAs and software engineers. So there are 5 supply chain applications that we have manual testers for. So we have a manual testing part of the team. Well, we'll call it a capability of the team. So we have a manual testing capability of the team, and then we also have an automated testing capability of the team. And on the automating testing capability, we have 2 different capabilities. We have mobile automation testing, and then we also have API automation testing. So it's been a wild journey putting the team together. I would break that down kind of into 3 parts: people, process, and technology.
Yeah.
First, just getting the right people together.
I
Right.
think that's
Make
yeah.
the right team with the right skill
Absolutely.
sets. Going through the interview process, figuring out, I think the hardest part for me for people was figuring out the work ethics of people and making sure that they fit the company and the team culture, because the company that I work for, niceness and leaving a positive impact is part of our mission and our vision statement. So we also have to always make sure that they fit the team culturally and they can work together as a team, because a lot of times in IT, we are like working by ourselves on a computer, just by ourselves. We're introverts, but as a QA, part of being good QA is the communication. Exactly, the communication and collaboration and asking the tough questions.
Yeah.
And then the second part I'll say is process. So when I got on the team, there were a lot of best practices that I needed to work on putting the team together. Little things as creating task cases. How do you create task cases? Your kind of naming conventions, making sure that they're highly descriptive names, making sure you have all your steps, putting in processes for peer reviews, and on the automation side as well, code reviews, making sure that we practice Agile very well, because a lot of times we're practicing what is considered Wagile, right? Like a little bit of waterfall and a little bit of Agile. Making sure that we're able to work towards our deadlines, because a lot of times when we have deadlines to meet, upper management comes up with a date. Really
Yep.
in Agile, you're supposed to let the work drive the dates, breaking down the stories, right? So we were giving all these big dates. We need to deliver this to customers by a certain date. So just making sure that we work towards that and making sure that we're not disappointing our leaders.
Yeah.
How we tag defects, how we create defects so that we can tag our defects right. Let's say all the defects that are found in Q1 or Q2 or Q3 of 2024 so that we can have the right metrics and try to improve our practices.
Yeah.
And just how we work with other teams. Generally,
cool.
just that process, improving the whole process. And then making sure we have the right technologies, the last side of it. Making sure that people are trained well, making sure we have the right test management tools, and I can go more into that later. Making sure that we have the right people who know the right programming languages. There are times that we have had people on the team who probably know a little bit of scripting, but not JavaScript. Just making sure we give them the right training that they need, people who know the right microservices, Git that we use, et cetera, et cetera. And just my own personal challenges as well on the team, because this is the biggest team that I've led or managed. Before I got this position, I used to manage teams of like 3 or 4 QAs and QEs, and now this is a huge team, and not just a huge team, but everybody works on a different application. I joke around and say sometimes I feel like for you to be successful at my position, you have to be a little bit attention deficient because you're always pulled in so many different directions for you to be successful. So just that was a very, very big challenge for me. But I had to learn to organize better. I had to learn to depend on my team better. Like when I got on the team at first, I wanted to attend one example. I wanted to attend all of those sprint meetings of all the different systems so that I know what's going on. But I quickly realized that was not the right way to do things. Exactly. I had to depend on my teams. I have my daily stand-up and I have my Kanban board that I work through, and just depend on the team to give me the right updates of where they are, all of our roadblocks, what we need to work on today, and discuss those and clear roadblocks. But yeah, that is, I think, the short version of what I have gone through over the past years.
The blueprint for how to set up a team properly, right? Just to explore some of those bits a bit more. So you mentioned kind of you've got a portfolio of projects that you're working on, or systems that you're working on, right? And you explained that you've got kind of the teams doing different types of testing, right? So you're implementing the test pyramid. And I'm interested in terms of the journey, both the people, processes, and the tooling. You articulate those things normally through a kind of an overarching strategy, right? But it's easy to say those things, right? And it's easy to write a strategy. It's hard to actually put those things in place. Can you just kind of talk to that a little bit in terms of how you went? I'm going to assume you went from not doing it in certain areas to actually starting to move towards it, and some areas achieving more than others sometimes.
Yeah, so we have the usual test pyramid of unit tests at the bottom. My team not do unit tests. The developers do unit tests, and then in the middle, ours is a little bit different. We explore what we call system integration testing, which is making sure that we test all our different systems and making sure that our systems all communicate with each other. So doing system integration testing, we're making sure that we have manual testing done, making sure that we execute some of our automation tests, and then after that we have our end-to-end tests. And as the pyramid gets thinner, we do exploratory testing and accessibility testing, and the testing that cannot be automated, the testing that cannot be shifted left. About strategy, that is exactly the same way that we continue to go. On each level of the pyramid, we just make sure that we prepare for testing for each, which is making sure all the teams that we're dependent on, because the systems that I currently lead, it's kind of like an assembly line. One system does what it's supposed to do and hands off to the next system. One very big issue, for example, that we have before we can even start our system integration testing, which is a strategy that we needed to put in place, was all of exactly what we need to test before we get to that stage. Data is a very big issue on on our testing side because our systems are very, very data driven. And we have what we call a master data team. There's always some kind of issue with a master data team, getting all of our data together before our deadlines, or data that is not properly configured. So making sure we task those teams and their leaders just to make sure that we have all of what we'll call a checklist or some kind of strategy before we can start testing. But it's a very simple pyramid that we just have those three little buckets in the pyramid that I just named. Yeah, that is kind of the way that we approach it.
It's the way I think of it. I think where a lot of teams get it wrong is they do far too much at the top, right? And so they get a lot of additional complexity because they're not breaking those things out, right? And the way that you mentioned integration is the perfect way to break out those challenges, right? In terms of creating those kind of those middle layers, those integration capabilities, did the team start out, almost from a kind of a green field? We don't have any assets, we don't have a system, we can do this out from the start, or did they have to switch from a traditionally misshaped pyramid? And I guess where I'm coming from with that is, how did they find that transition if they needed to do it? And if they didn't need to do it, or even if they did need to do it, were there challenges in terms working with developers, understanding how those interfaces work, those kind of challenges that normally come when you're trying to do that middle layer?
There are always challenges. Exactly. Even though we have a simpler pyramid right now, but we still have challenges with them. Yes, we did start off with the usual pyramid of like unit testing at the bottom, a little bit of component testing, a little bit of integration testing. Then we get to, like, as it gets slimmer, as we go at the top, we did have UI testing and API testing and manual testing.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, especially like I mentioned earlier, because of the dates that we have, we don't have enough time to do all of that. We have to just compress some of we have to compress some of them together and find out issues as we go by. That is why testing is highly important, although sometimes I feel like developers don't unit test as well as possible. So a lot of that testing falls on QA. But QA testing obviously is highly important, because when something with a defects gets to production, and QA is the first thing that is looked at. But yes, we tried that and it didn't work, and we just tried to simplify it as we go along, and that is what so far has been working. But it just depends on how complex some of the changes are. Sometimes we do get a lot of issues in like the middle part of the pyramid. That is where we started thinking more about bringing more automation in, so that we shift some of the testing left. And a lot of our projects are found earlier on than much later in the test cycle or the pyramid. Yeah. So as we go along, we make changes. Whatever does not work, we try to make it better until it works for everybody.
Cool. I guess a big important part of that transformation, as you mentioned, is the people side of it, right? And so it sounds as though you've got testers who are forward looking, let's say, in the way that you implement testing. I guess as well as that, and you need your stakeholders to be supportive, right? In terms of like your developers working with your testers, but also, your product owners, or, if you're doing Agile, I'm sure you've got project managers that are leading Scrum teams, or things like that, odd arrangements where they have a confidence or a misplaced confidence in the way that it's historically been done. Right. Is that kind of a dynamic that you've had to face into?
Yes, you mentioned shifting, advocating for QA. I think one of the hardest things is, like you mentioned, is the mindset. That's the first thing, like getting our leaders to be on our side. One question that I always ask is, when we were going through just the transformation process, and it's still going on, we made some improvements, is QA a separate entity? Like it always is. Like QA comes in after requirements have been gathered, signed, sealed, and they deliver it to us. We can't make any changes. Yeah. Or during the testing period, and then let's say in production during maintenance. But I see it as, if we need to shift QA left, QA does not need to be a separate entity or separate point that we test or have QA, but QA should be a fully integrated, continuous process, right? Yeah. So that's one question that I always take to them. This is what we currently have, but QA should be a continuous process. Every part or
Absolutely.
every phase of the SDLC needs to involve QA. People tend to think of QA as just testers, but testing is not just what we do, right? We're quality analysts, right? From the planning phase, QA or testers and automation engineers need to be involved. We need to understand right from the start the scope of the project, the scope of testing for this project, the scope of the changes for this project.
Absolutely.
Just changing that mentality, getting everybody to invite QA and QEs and software engineers to all of the meetings right at the start. That has been the biggest push. And sometimes the new projects that come in, and we work also with other contractors that are helping us build this application. And sometimes we do need training with some of those contractors. And if you bring QA in or QE in very late, they don't even realize that we need that training until much later. Talking about having TPOs and product owners and product managers, I've been in instances where they're like, okay, we'll go through the training with whoever the contractor is, and then we'll train the QA team. And I'm like, no, we can't do that. We should all be in the same training at the same time, be able to have the people who created the application who we're working it with or who are going to help us create the application, and be able to ask them questions directly instead of having you guys as the middleman. Yeah. But it is still a very, 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 very big pushback, and which is kind of the role that I play, which is not just a manager, but an advocate, which is not just leading the team and inspiring people to get the work done or helping people to see their initiatives and how they can grow, but also letting everybody else in the organization know the role that QA plays, how important QA is. We're the last safety net before the customer uses the application. Like I said earlier, implementing automation in the right way, so that as soon as code is delivered, having the right CI/CD pipeline, as soon as code is delivered, we're testing it immediately and we're catching the defects immediately. Manual testing takes such a long time to test. If we do not have automation testing, especially with all the huge applications that we have, there's no way we'll be able to regression test before we make it to production or regression test everything. We would go to production taking huge risks. So yes, like I said earlier, changing that mindset and letting them understand how important QA is at every phase, during the planning phase, during the requirement phase, even something as having a proper definition of done. A lot of times people think only TPOs or product owners and developers or engineers should come up with a definition of done. But QAs need to be in that meeting, because QAs need to give their own input on what done looks like. Like they would always say, the 3 Amigos, make sure you have all the 3 different teams. And just enforcing that, making sure we keep pushing that even if we're in meetings and we're not asking questions, even if we're just listening, it is much better than not having QA there, because it helps us to be able to think and ask the right question in the next phase of the product development lifecycle.
How do you go about doing that then? Have you internally, is there, other than just sort of, I guess, trying to dive into meetings that maybe you don't get invited to, do you sort of have internal initiatives or meetups, or I don't know, is there a way that you try and sort of promote the fact that don't leave us till last, because the stuff we find is going to be super important and you want us to be ready to try and find it before it hits a customer, right? Like what's your sort of ethos on that?
That's a good question. So there's several changes that I made, or just improvements that I would say. One, like you mentioned, influencing the internal, like I mentioned earlier, and we mentioned influencing the internal views of quality. I also mentioned having that QA advocate or champion. But another thing is having a testing center of excellence, right? Which is where we take a look at everything that is quality related, right? All of our best practices, governing the full quality process, inviting them to some of these meetings. We have monthly meetings that we go through new improvements that QA can bring onto the team, and just letting them be exposed to that and just the benefits of it. So one of the starters that I did with when I started the conversation was, I guess we've all seen it, the Boehm's curve that talks about how expensive it is to fix a defect the later in the software development lifecycle that you find the defect, right?
Right?
Right, exactly. So it gets more expensive as we go. And I also found some data that I also presented to them that we talk about regularly in our testing center of excellence. We put figures to that number. So you really understand how much money we're saving the organization. And every organization wants to make profit, right? If you know that you are saving money, and it shows that graph was collected by that data was collected by HP a few years ago. And it tells us that, it reminds us that if a defect is found in the design phase, it's 3 times more expensive to fix. If it is found in the testing phase, it is 7 times more expensive to fix than if it is found in the requirement phase. And it is 30 or more times expensive to fix if it is found in the QA phase. So just letting them understand in the statistics, and like I said earlier, reminding them of how beneficial automation is, right? Automation helps us to test early and test repeatedly, right? So we have pipelines, for example, that we execute every day to make sure that all of our tests pass. Like I mentioned earlier, reminding them of catching defects early, reminding them of the time that was saved with testing, reminding them of the financial advantages of testing early, reminding them of how good the quality of the software would be if we test early and catch our defects early. And most importantly, reminding them that our software is also our brand, right? It is not just, okay, we test, but if we have an application that does not work or breaks, nobody would want to use our application. Nobody would want to go on use our apps to their food when they get to our restaurants. So just reminding them that it's not just financial is one, but the one that you can even add a money value to, right? We've all used websites where, let's say, for example, at the worst time when you click submit, it breaks. You would not want to go back to that website because you wouldn't be sure if you've already been charged before or you're going to be charged again. Just reinforcing that through our testing center of excellence, making sure that even if our QA director or some of our directors don't attend the meeting, making sure that we spread the word out, updating some of our internal pages that we share and share it out to everybody so that they know that work that we're doing. And metrics, for example, is one thing that we also bring up in some of that testing center of excellence. So metrics helps us to calculate or project how we're getting better as the quarters go by. So part of the vision statement that I put together is we have a long vision statement, but just a little part of it says we should be able to catch our defects before they get to production, right? We also show how we get better with time at that. Yes, when we have new applications and new features, sometimes those numbers we might catch a few new defects in production, but mainly we show those numbers regularly every quarter of the severity and the priority of defects and the number of defects that we found in QA versus in prod. So you see how
movements.
The investments that you've made are giving back good returns.
It's really important. And I'm a practitioner in testing, and I used to lead a COE, and you know that central North Star in terms of what best practice look like is important. But I think the points you made there around the ability to demonstrate continual improvement and the ability for peers to talk about continual improvement is so powerful, right? In terms of gaining momentum across the whole organization. I mean, if it's just a top-down message, it's not. There's a message that are people actually listening, and do they believe they can actually put that into place? Right. But actually, if it's coming from your peers and it's challenges they've overcome that others are facing into, then it's so much more powerful for creating that momentum, right? I think, you know, to the metrics, to be able to see progress and validation that actually the bits of work you're doing are improving things. You know, are we ever done? Probably not. But you want to see progress in terms of, I've put this effort in this last quarter, and yes, I can see the needle moving. And actually, I can then go and promote that to my managers or wider team. There is validation there, right? And therefore, it's far more fulfilling around the job you're doing day to day, right? You can see an outcome.
Do Natalie, do you have like some metrics that you sort of live by? Have you got sort of these are the ones that for me are most important, for the business are most important? I know a lot of people follow like DORA metrics and MTTR and that sort of stuff. I think they're all very personal, depending on your business and your brand and what you're trying to do and how much is on fire versus how much is very good and all of those sorts of things, right? So is there something that you're like, this is the one that I'm into and this is why?
The most important for me is what they would consider. I know I've seen this terminology being used in the IT or software dev industry, which is defect leakage ratio, which is the number of defects that make it to production versus the number of defects that we catch in QA.
Yeah.
That for me is the gold star. That's the North Star. If we catch the majority of our defects in QA, even let's say worst case scenario, there's a critical defect that makes it to production. Nobody likes a critical defect making it to production. But if we have shown that there were 150 defects caught, and we caught the majority of our critical defects in production, that says a lot. Now, we make sure those areas that are highly scarce, we test them very well. So majority of the times we do catch our critical and high defects in QA, but that's the most important for me. The defects that leak to production that we don't catch and the severity of those defects. Because if they're low-level defects that we can easily come up with a workaround while we fix and we can work on other stuff while we're fixing that, then it's not that important. But keeping those critical defects out of production and catching them in QA, that is my most important.
That's interesting. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think just to add on in terms of coming from a background where measures in testing are especially important. I think psychological safety in organization is an important part there in terms of how you're going to use that metric. I think there is a real danger if metrics are used as weapons around certain things that do and don't happen. I think, is testing an absolute fail-safe? No, it's not, right? And so I don't say there's no blame, but we always need to rail back in terms of when we're doing proper root cause around why certain things happened, we actually do that and we go and address those things so they can't happen in the future rather than blaming them over there, right? Because I think there's a lot of that goes on.
Definitely. That is a very good point, which is what we do. We do what we'll call a root cause analysis to understand what phase we missed the defect in, or a postmortem, right? Where we understand what happened, how we can fix this, and how we can prevent this. How do we add more test cases to catch this, to prevent it the next time? How do we put it in automation so it runs every day and we never ever miss it again? But yes, definitely that metrics are used to help us improve our testing.
Yeah. That's super good. You mentioned, so this is going back a little bit, but so you've got quite a large team, right? So I think 10, 11 people, right, under your team. You mentioned like the hiring process around talent and that sort of stuff. How do you, so your like work ethic, I think, came up as one of the points. How are you sort of trying to judge that? This is obviously not so much a testing question, but a people process question. So I always think that's quite tough. Have you got methods? Are you like got questions that you're asking? What are you trying to ask people, I guess?
And you're right. Work ethic is actually one of the hardest to be able to figure out during an interview, right? Because during an interview, everybody's trying to sell themselves. Yeah. And I would ask questions such as the projects that you've worked on. What was your role on those projects? For you to go in detail as much as possible. So it's either you'd rather been in that role or you shadowed somebody really close, but you probably would not know the answer to that. But you have to be as detailed as possible. Tell me your role, tell me the improvements that you made, tell me what you learned from it, tell me about the defects that you caught in production. And we're able to try to judge. You would not know 100% until the person joins your team.
For sure.
And a lot of times when people have worked on projects themselves, they, like I said, can go into as much detail as possible because they have lived the process. They lived through testing, they lived through the horrors and the pains of sometimes working more than 8 hours a day or finding a defect last minute, so they're able to go into much detail. I've interviewed people sometimes that would tell you a certain situation and they can only give you 1 or 2 lines, not go into that much detail, or try to say I was not the one who was actually working on that. So just by the answers that they give, you are able to judge. But like I said, the most important judge is you getting on the team and proving yourself. But you're right, that has been the hardest part, because I had to learn through that a lot of people would oversell themselves.
Yeah, just because everybody, I think most people have got that thing that, like, that bug that they found that was wild, or like, oh, can you imagine if we didn't get it? Or so, I would say a lot of people, but you've got to have done it. You got to have walked through it and figured out, actually, this was, we only found it because of X, Y, X, Y, X, Y, right, and go into it. So yeah, I mean, I guess you never really know, but it just shows how important work ethic is, I think, especially in this world, right? Especially in the world of quality and stuff. You quite often don't get enough time, or it's a lot about you chasing down, you trying to push other teams to be aware of why it's important early. And do you do any internal, we've done this before, I've done this before, where we've put some of our sales team through like a day as a tester, right? So we'll give them some pretty loose requirements, we'll give them some pretty loose things to go and achieve, and just ask them to go and do some testing for us. Have you done anything like that internally? Have you sort of thought about trying to get some of your leadership team into a room and start testing some software and see how tough it is?
Leadership team testing? Currently, no. Not since I got on the team. I don't know if they did that before I got on the team. What has been the closest to that, which is not them testing, but in my past, I worked at an organization where I can't remember exactly what we used to call it, but it's more like a day in life. Okay. Because I can't remember the exact name, which we bring in our customers and see how they use our testware without us asking them questions. And leadership also sits in some of those meetings and hear as they talk through how they use our testware, our software, and understand how it is used from a user point of view versus how we test. Because users might use an application very differently from the way we test. So they have seen that because they've been in meetings like that and understand. And then at the end, we would ask them questions of why were they slower to, for example, choose this? Were they trying to understand why this question was worded a certain way, or what was coming up next, or what did this little hyperlink mean, et cetera, et cetera. So they've been in meetings like that, but they have not directly tested since I got on the team. I don't know if they've done it in the past.
No, it totally makes sense. Day in the life sounds fun. Yeah, that's good. So I think the other piece that sort of sits in my mind is that there's so much change, technology, different challenges that sort of go around the space. What advice would you give to somebody to try and, how do you keep up with it all, right? So you've got 10 people, loads of different projects, loads of new technology. How are you trying to kind of keep up with the latest and the greatest of what's going on in the industry and that sort of stuff?
Well, a lot of ways, a few ways. One, I go to IT meetups. We have 2 different QA meetups in Atlanta. AQA, with his Association of QA Analysts, is one. And then we just have QAs in Atlanta. So I keep up with those. I attend those regularly. I attend the conference that I met you at, which is the Quality Conference, the biggest one on the East Coast of the US. And I plan on continuing to go to those and attending those. But just also self-education, right? A lot of times, yes, we can, and what we hear from other people come in and give presentations and all of that. But you are the architect of your career. You have to make sure that there's several YouTube channels that you can watch. There's several articles that are written out there. There's just so many different QA communities. Ministry of Testing, be a part of the QA voice out there, whether it is on LinkedIn, whether it is on YouTube. Take in as much information as you can and bring them and try them on your team, right? Not just listening to them. Yeah. If they work, then we know it is a good process that works for your team. If it doesn't work, then we can make some tweaks to
Right.
it
Yeah.
and see, right, and see what works. But learning from other people and applying it in your life, but being your own architect, being the architect of your career. You have to go there and chase things and learn and implement them on your team.
Would be all right. Would we be okay in saying that I think you're doing a session at a Q&A?
You are right.
Do you want to talk to us a bit about that?
So in August, I have it's more like I'm opening for somebody. So it would be like a 10-15 minute talk, and I will be talking about shift and left, which is why it's important for QA to be involved at every stage of development lifecycle. So I'm basically going to talk about what QA is right now in certain organizations. They're not every organization does it right. Like I said, there are probably 3 phases where QA comes in most organizations. Especially, I met some people at the conference who were like, we're just building QA now at our department. We know if you're starting your QA department right now, you have a lot to learn, right? So just teaching those people that these are pitfalls of involving QA late in the software development life cycle. Remind them of those pitfalls, remind them of the benefits of involving QA early, showing them in the whole software development life cycle, each sprint, what QA can do in each phase, because people think, QA, no, they don't need to be included until they need it. So just the overall that we are quality analysts and not just quality, and we're quality analysts and not just testers, and talking about the whole quality process with an emphasis on people, process, and technology. There's some QA organizations that only have QAs and not QEs.
Yeah.
And you cannot have QA in this innovative, fast-paced, moving world without automation. I've been on teams where we only have automation. So making those distinctions between the QA role and the QE role, making sure that the QA team is respected, because there's not some organizations, QA is not that respected. People think everybody can be a QA. So just making emphasis on all of that, making emphasis on teams working together, having paired programming days on some days where our QEs sit with our software engineers and understand the process, making sure that we are all in the same code review sessions, because at some organizations, QAs are just black box testers, right?
Yeah.
QAs need to be white box testers. If you tear up an application apart, QAs need to understand all the little components that make up that. So emphasizing all of that and talking about the right skills that QA need, talking about behavior-driven development, writing our scripts in a form of the exact behavior that user uses our application, talking about automation and regression testing, and then talking about all the different levels of testing. Yes, I will just be breaking the iceberg, just the tip of the iceberg on all of these different topics that I've mentioned, but talking about having UI testing, a little bit of the benefits of API testing, making sure we're testing at all levels. It makes sense to have API testing because APIs are easier and faster to test than the UI. It's talking about all the benefits. And now Gen AI is also a very, 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 very big and new part of QA and software dev that's coming up. At my organization, we have not started including Gen AI yet, but we're talking about having those POCs, but throwing it out there, some of the benefits that Gen AI has. I saw at a conference that I attended some tools that would help you come up with test scenarios and test cases, and that helps you go much faster than if human beings come up with it. You just have to fill in the gap. So just have a brief overview of a little bit of those. So that is what I'll be talking about.
Fantastic.
Cool. Just want to touch on kind of the shift left BDD that you've mentioned there in terms of how we've touched on it a little bit earlier when you talked about the kind of the cost of finding a defect and kind of the exponential cost if you don't find these things in requirements. I guess that it kind of also feeds into the kind of the quality of everybody's responsibility buzzword, and I'll call it a buzzword, where actually people say that a lot, but they don't actually follow some of the good practices around shifting left. I'm going to talk about BDD in terms of what successes are you finding in terms of your teams practicing BDD, 3 Amigos, and a very difficult question, apologies, but have you got any metric around kind of the proactive elimination of bugs rather than having to find them in test?
The proactive elimination of what?
Bugs. So, but they won't be bugs. There'll be requirements that are either not well articulated or articulated incorrectly.
So I think those are three questions.
Sorry, that was a big old question. You got me excited.
I can remember that. What was the first question? I probably should have taken some notes.
More around some of your experiences around kind of practicing BDD through Amigos and the elimination of things that would have been historically defects found in test, but actually because you're having those conversations, the conversations are eliminating those challenges. Everybody actually understands the intent of what you're trying to do, right?
Yes. So practicing BDD has really helped us find defects much earlier in the test phase than just testing from a tester's point of view. Yeah. We have, for example, one of our mobile applications. We have a team that is a help desk team that we work really close with because they know exactly how the users use the application. So we meet with them once a month just for knowledge transfer. And based on some of the scenarios that they give them, that is how we build our BDD scripts. And we're realizing that we're catching most of our defects much earlier rather than much later.
Yeah.
Secondly, you talked about 3 Amigos. In QA and even in software development, I think that is a really good point that you bring up because communication and collaboration is something that we kind of take for granted. But the work cannot be done very well without properly collaborating and always communicating. Yeah. When you build those relationships with your business team and the engineering team and QA in the middle, it's easy for you to just walk over at somebody's desk and ask them more questions when questions come up because you've built those good relationships. And it's not just one person from each team. You should have those relationships with everybody. And even though sometimes we work from home, but that is also a benefit of in person when we go to work in person. Because walking over at somebody's desk and asking a question is so much easier than asking them a question through IM. So building those relationships have really, 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 really helped us in getting the right requirements and finding our defects right at the start. Can you repeat the third question again for me?
I don't know what it was.
I think it was benefits of something.
I think it's more around, and it's a difficult one to measure, right, in terms of any metric around implementing those practices. Are there any metric that you're either collecting now or want to collect in the future that tries to articulate that actually those early conversations, that shifting left, is far more efficient in terms of removal of defects than it would should you do traditional testing? Appreciate that actually if the defect never existed, then do you raise it as a bug and therefore have a metric to collect?
Right now, I don't have like an exact formula for a metric.
That's right.
Regarding that, apart from our defects have significantly reduced.
The trends have gone down.
In production, right. So it fits into that particular defect or the number of defects that make it to production versus the number of defects that we find in test.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. I think that made sense. Totally.
I'm conscious of time. One last question. If you were to give some advice to a QE manager like yourself, leading a team, but struggling with where to get going or where to start, what kind of quick snippet of advice would you give them in terms of kind of moving the needle a little bit in terms of the right direction?
I'd say, one, you got to believe in yourself. You definitely have to have that confidence in yourself that you can get the work done. Secondly, you have to know that you have to understand your leadership style. Are you a delegator? If you are the kind of person who delegates or your position allows you to delegate everything, you have to make sure that you build trust in your team members so that when they give you information, they give you the right information. You help them to make sure that they communicate and collaborate well. You have to have a vision statement that emphasizes, even if it's not in the form of a statement, but I think your number one thing should be defects need to be caught in QA, especially those critical and high defects, rather than rather than in production. But basically enjoy the ride.
Yeah.
Innovate as you go. As you learn, continue to innovate with your team. It is called continuous improvement.
Yeah.
For a process, because what we're doing today might be a little bit different in 6 months, just our processes. Try new processes and see what works for your team. There is no one size fit all. It just depends on the type of systems that you work with, the people that you work with, how well you practice agile, and all of that. But that's basically what I would say. Believe in yourself, trust your team, empower your team, enjoy the ride, and be continuously improving.
Awesome advice. Well, with that, I'd like to thank Ben for being my co-host, and more so, I'd like to thank Natalie for her brilliant views, brilliant guidance, excellent advice at the end. A podcast veteran, you might say.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Yeah, thanks very so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Brilliant.
Pleasure.
All right, thanks everybody for listening again, and look out for the next one. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. To continue the conversation, head over to curiositysoftware.ie and subscribe for more episodes.